What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Phil Klay. How are you, Phil?
I'm doing well, doing very well.
I'm
Phil
trying to see
Klay, actually.
what's this?
It's pronounced Klay. Yeah.
Klay, there it is. And that's the first correction of the podcast, which is great. Again, because I feel like most people are going to say Clay anyways. So that's good for most people to know. Where are you podcasting in from? You're on the East Coast, right?
I'm from Queens. Yeah. So,
Queens, okay.
In Queens. Yeah.
Yeah. I was born, well, actually, we were talking just before, but I was born in Rego Park, Queens.
Oh, the very close by.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, no, most definitely. My mom's from
There,
Queens.
some very good food in Rego Park.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah, yeah.
Though not a lot open on Fridays.
Definitely not. And I'm sure we'll get to that. So you didn't start out in Queens, New York, though. Where were you from originally? Where were you born?
I was born in White Plains, New York. So
Okay,
I've come far in life. I've gotten over the Whitestone Bridge.
And this is the first question I usually ask in the podcast. Did you write your first words in White Plains, New York?
Yeah, I'm sure. I must have.
Were you writing as a kid? I mean, were you reading as a kid? I mean, you are
always
writers,
reading
so
a lot. Yeah,
that, right?
Reading a lot as a kid, right? I used to, like hide underneath the covers with like a flashlight after my parents had told me to go to sleep so I could keep reading books.
Any idea what you remember reading back then?
I was big into like fantasy type stuff. So I loved, Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. I loved the Black Cauldron, that series, Watership Down, the Redwall series, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think we're a little similar in age. I'm 33. But my introduction to reading when I was a kid, I mean, the first things I remember was like the Goosebumps series, the Scholastic.
Oh yeah,
I mean things like that, right? Sure. And it's like as a kid, you're like, what the fuck is this? Right. And as you get older, it's funny if you read about R.L. Stine now. I mean, the guy's a pretty fascinating guy. But as a kid, I mean, you don't think about this dude's pumping these books out. I mean, one after another after another. It's pretty crazy. That's cool. So you're growing up in the East Coast. I mean, what are you doing as a kid? I mean, are you kind of like a punk kid? Are you a good kid? I mean, what's your day like?
I'd like to think I was a good kid. I don't know. Just a normal kid. I'm one of 5 boys, so the household was, climbing trees and playing roller hockey and that kind of thing.
Where do you fall on the spectrum of the 5 boys?
I'm number 3.
Literally the middle child.
Right in the middle, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I have an older brother and a younger sister, so I'm a middle kid too. So growing up, so you're in the East Coast.
Yeah.
You're going to.
So right next to where I grew up, my great aunts, the aunties, these like 3 aunts who are very, very important to me. Unfortunately, one is only one is still alive, but Aunt Mimi, Aunt Pixie, and Aunt Boo. I was Aunt Boo's favorite, and when there was 3 of us, she always used to say, like, it's really tough being, the youngest. And then when my 2 younger kids were born, she was like, it's really tough being the middle child. My older brother was like, wait, you can't change the rules that way. I used to be the middle child.
That's crazy. So were your brothers close? I mean, 5, that's a lot of kids.
Yeah. Great.
Were any of them kind of in artistic fields at that time? Or you kind of, were you in an artistic
field? No. So it's funny. So for my 2 oldest brothers, my oldest brother is a musician, right? And Megan Jean and the KFB. You want to check out a song of theirs, just type in KFB and These Bones and nice. Megan Jean and the KFB, and it'll pop up. It's pretty awesome. You get a sense of what they do. And then my second oldest brother is a former Marine who did 2 deployments to Iraq and now works at the Pentagon.
Okay.
So I'm sort of, if you think about what I do artistically, it's sort of like in the middle of those 2 guys. Yeah.
And we're gonna get there for sure because obviously. Mm-hmm. So you go to high school. I mean, are you writing in high school at all? Are you putting any kind of words to paper at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first story that I ever wrote that it felt like I was risking something, showing it to somebody, right? Yeah. I wrote in high school. And
what short story, or was it what was it?
It was a short story. We had to write a satire for an English class. Christian Talbot was my teacher, great guy, and I wrote this satire that was you know, it was offensive, and it was me trying to be funny. It was me trying to make some real points, and I was very nervous about it. So I showed it to him. I showed it to the teacher like 2 weeks early.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's a lot of profanity and stuff in this. So, I don't know if it's appropriate. So I just wanted you to read it so you could tell me if I need to write something different. But really what I wanted to do was to show it to him and get his opinion. And then he started reading it. He started laughing while he was reading it. And that was like the best feeling in the world.
Having spoken to you, I've known you now for 8 minutes. It seems like you do have a sense of humor. I like to think I have a sense of humor too. And your writing has a sense of humor to it as well. It's interesting, I've talked to luckily a whole bunch of authors now. And, some people are very serious and it comes off in their writing. It's kind of their personality. You're saying that you wrote this first story and he started laughing. That immediate gratification, was that something that immediately stuck with you? You're like, well, now I can maybe do something with my written word and have an emotion come from people.
It wasn't just the laughter, right? It was, the great thing about laughter, right? It's like, it's just involuntary reaction. And it's an immediate sign that people like what you're doing. But like, it was the sense that I had put something that felt like a real risk on the page, and the last thing that you want is for somebody to look at that and be like, and he liked it. I think that humor is actually really, really important. I don't think, if you don't have a sense of humor, I don't think you're really serious, because it's a ridiculous world. There's a bit from Emerson, and I'll just give it to you real quickly, where he says, reason does not joke, and men of reason do not. A prophet in whom the moral sentiment predominates, or a philosopher in whom the love of truth predominates, these do not joke, but they bring the standard, the ideal whole. And then later he says, there's no joke so true and deep in actual life as when some pure idealist goes up and down the institutions of society, attended by a man who knows the world, and who, sympathizing with the philosopher's scrutiny, sympathizes also with the confusion and indignation of the detected, skulking institutions, his perception of disparity, his eye wandering perpetually from the rule to the crooked, lying, thieving fact, makes the eyes run over with laughter. This is the radical joke of life and then of literature. And I love that, right? And I think it's from the rule to the crooked, lying, thieving fact is such an important thing. It's such an important thing for the writer to be attuned to. I think literature, even if it's not being explicitly funny, right, has to have a certain type of sensibility to it. And you can tell when somebody has something of a comic sensibility. That is also, I think, a big thing in American letters in particular. Twain and Ellison at least thought there was.
And with humor, it can be a kind of a slippery slope, right? I mean, if the words what you're reading is too humorous, like you're saying, there needs to be seriousness behind it, right? Because things are so crazy, so fucked up all the time. That's why I love stand-up comedy. If you talk to any stand-up comedian outside of them being funny, they're usually very dark, very miserable people. Yet they have right. It's like that's what it is. But they're able to now expunge that out of themselves and make it humorous and make us laugh. Like Philip Roth is one that comes to mind. Very funny but very serious. Very dark. Things like that.
War literature is some of the funniest literature ever written.
Oh yeah,
right?
For sure.
Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, The Good Soldier Schweck, Catch-22.
Well, wait. All right. Well, you say Catch-22. Did you like Catch-22? It's one of
those
books. Well, you say, of course, right? I feel like it's one of those books, and you're smiling. People can't see you smiling. It's one of those books that, like, I enjoyed it. I wasn't blown away. There were times, what I'm saying? I mean, I feel like it's fallen into the historical significant realm in a slot. It's there to stay. It's fine. It was a book I kind of put off for a long time reading, self-admittedly. I must have,
Okay, but come on, like, is there a more amazing American character than Milo, right? Like,
it's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous how original really it is. But at the same time, it was a little not fantastical for me, but it was just a little.
Or even just the idea of the Catch-22 is so perfect, right?
Great title.
And then that intense scene with the injury that's sort of at the heart of it. It's funny. I mean, so I don't love Catch-22 the way some people do. Larkin called it the American hymn to cowardice. But there's marvelous stuff.
You could do an entire podcast on just that book. We'll let other people do that. All right, cool. So you're in high school. You got older brothers. You got younger brothers. I don't know what you're doing. You're hanging out. You go to college eventually. That's kind of when your life, I think, starts to take a little bit of a change. Or was there something happen before college?
Well, so I mean, high school. So I went to a Jesuit high school called Regis, and that was very, very important. And you've read Missionaries and Redeployment. You'll note that sort of Jesuits pop up. And certain things that are informed by that. It's a very, the Jesuits are an order of Catholic priests. They tend to be extremely intellectual, right? And there's a real sort of richness to the way that they approach education that was pretty important to me. And also a sort of sensibility that, I was part of a group called Kiro in high school where, we read Catholic literature, but part of it, the organization was also, we would volunteer at this hospice. And the idea was that, sort of what you were reading had to be tied to sort of actually going out and doing real physical things in the world.
Intense for a 16-year-old boy.
Yeah. It was interesting. It was a hospice in the village, run by Sisters of Charity, which is Mother Teresa's order. And it was a surprisingly joyful place, right? It was very interesting. They cooked the spiciest food that you would possibly imagine.
Okay, so you're starting off on that track, obviously. What made you went to Dartmouth, correct?
Yep.
Was there a push towards that college specifically? I mean, what was the choice behind that? Were you going into college to become a writer? What were you going to college for?
Yeah. I was ultimately deciding between that and Georgetown School of Foreign Service. If you'd asked me in high school, I probably would have told you I wanted to be a diplomat. My maternal grandfather had been a diplomat, and I always admired that. I was always fascinated by U.S. foreign policy. I wasn't sure I wanted to be sort of on that specific track. I knew I wanted to study writing. Dartmouth had a good program. But, I was, 17 when I was making the decision. So, I went to Dartmouth and had a fun time, which is the dumb reason that a lot of people ultimately will decide, So, and it was, it's beautiful. I ended up loving it. I had a great experience. I ended up meeting Tom Slay there, who became very important to me, sort of in terms of writing. He's a poet who was my thesis advisor when I did a creative writing thesis.
Were you writing poetry?
No. I was writing fiction, but they paired me with Tom. I don't know what the rationale behind pairing me with Tom was, but it was perfect. Our sensibilities were very similar. And so sort of funny, after that, Tom went out and started doing, conflict reporting, which has sort of made its way into his poetry in really profound ways that has been influential to me as I've been writing.
So what were you writing in college? I mean, you weren't writing the stories that would become Redeployment? I mean,
I was writing stories.
Nothing long form, no grand novel in your mind at that time?
No grand novel. I was working on stories. I was working on my craft. You know what I mean? I was trying to write good stories. That's what I was trying to do. And reading a lot. And when I met Tom, and he knew that I was joining the Marine Corps, or going into the Marine Corps, and would probably end up deploying to a war zone after I graduated. He was like, all right, now I'm going to have you read some of the greatest minds to ever write about war. So,
can I pause you there real quick?
Yeah.
You made a pretty large jump. You made a jump from writing short stories in Dartmouth to joining the Marine Corps. How did that happen? What was that? I mean, was that something you always want? You said you wanted to be maybe a diplomat. I mean, how did the Marine Corps?
Well, our nation was at war, right?
Well, so let people know. I mean, what time? What year is it?
This was I started to college in 2001.
Some people listening to this podcast were maybe not even alive when September 11th happened.
Right.
For reference, I was a freshman. I was 20 miles east of Manhattan. I'm sorry, west of Manhattan. When 9/11 happened, I was standing on my locker, freshman year of high school, in between first and second period, and Tyler Goodwin came up to my locker. My dad worked in the Twin Towers from 1990 to 2000. Worked on the 98th floor. Oh
my God.
Oh yeah. I mean, of course. Took me to. I mean, I was on the top of that building half a dozen times. And he told me it happened. So just so people are aware, that's what we're talking about. So this is
right. Yeah. So, and I'd always wanted to do something in terms of public service. Public service is very important in my family. Service, notion of service in general. And then we were suddenly at war. I was actually, when 9/11 happened, I was in the woods. So I didn't experience 9/11 in the kind of like media saturated way that everybody else did, where they're sort of watching these images on the screen repeating themselves, watching the news. No, I was in the woods, and we'd heard rumors that we'd first discounted. Right.
Were you hiking? Where in the woods? Appalachian Trail? Where were you?
I was on the Appalachian Trail. It was like a Dartmouth, welcome to Dartmouth, go hike the Appalachian Trail thing. Then we were in Afghanistan very soon after that, and soon to be going into Iraq. So, that seemed to be the way, it just seemed logical, right, to join. I mean, why didn't you join?
Me, well, I was, it's interesting, and I'm happy you asked that, right? So really, we're talking because I did a podcast with I think you're Elliot Ackerman.
Yeah, great guy.
So I did a podcast with him, and I said in that episode,
hell of a writer too,
badass writer, badass dude. And
just
really is. But I said in that episode, I'm like, you know what? If I had a chance to, if I had 3 chances to go back in time and do it over again, one of the things I would have done is join the Marine Corps. It's something that, as I get older, I impose discipline in myself, through my own self-discipline. There's no outside force doing it. No one's doing this podcast for me. I'm doing it. That said, when I was younger, I could have used that discipline. Really, I mean, 17, 18, I was a punk kid. I was smoking weed, playing punk rock. I wasn't a bad kid, but I wasn't aiming towards Dartmouth. You know what I'm saying? So you asked me why didn't I join? At the time, that wasn't the person I was. Looking back on it now, it might have been good for me. That said, we don't need to. So you join the Marine Corps. You are deployed, correct?
So I was a public affairs officer. So, I worked with the media. I had a group of Marines who would write stories, take photographs, do stuff on what the unit was doing, convey information back to the families, mostly for base papers and that sort of thing, but also would work with journalists. So when journalists would come through and want to embed with the unit, they'd make their way through where I was. I was in Anbar province, which was, I was in Taqadum, which was this base sort of in between Ramadi and Fallujah. And it was an interesting job, right? Very safe job relative to other jobs, okay? Because, I was in probably the most violent place in Iraq when I came in there, but my job was relatively safe, right? But because of the nature of it, I'd go out on the patrol with the infantry, I'd hang out with engineers, with mortuary affairs guys, doctors, nurses, that whole. So I sort of saw a pretty wide range of things, and I, kind of do everything from being in a Humvee with a bunch of, Lance corporals to sitting in on the battle update assessment briefs. I went to General Odierno, was in charge of.
And what were the years of your deployment?
So January 2007 to February 2008. So there was a sort of large surge of troops to Iraq. So basically what happened was we invaded Iraq, and as was utterly predictable, the country sort of spiraled into chaos, right? They tended to put ideologues in charge rather than people, a lot of the people who sort of understood the country also vocally also were very opposed to the war. You had some particularly terrible decisions made early on. And of course, Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, really didn't want to do any nation building, or he was often at odds with the Reconstruction effort and undermined it in various ways, and sort of denied requests for additional troops for security as the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. And you had this sort of building insurgency of various types, right? So you had sort of more secular attacks against US troops. You had sort of hardcore Islamist groups, the Monotheism and Jihad, which was the group that would later become Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which would later become ISIS. So it had sort of moved in to kind of take advantage of the chaos. You had on the other side, Shia militias. So it was just a very volatile, chaotic situation. And that spun out of control, and the violence became utterly horrific by 2006. And they decided to sort of change strategy, to do a sort of counterinsurgency approach, increase the number of troops in Iraq, try and partner more with local forces. There's a whole kind of change in how we were supposed to do things. And I came in that period, right? And at the same time, there was a movement called the Anbar Awakening, which was basically a group of sheikhs who, for a variety of reasons, had decided to ally with the Americans to fight back Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And that had started in very late 2006. And so during the time that I was there, Anbar was a very, very violent province, but we started having these successful partnerships with local tribesmen, and sort of slowly bringing the level of violence down in city by city. And so that was sort of what happened during the year that I was there. Like there's the first month that I'm there, huge suicide truck bombing, carrying like injured men, women, and children, into the combat hospital on our base. By the end, like it was fairly actually quiet and somewhat boring by the time that I left, right? Which was interesting, right? Because it felt like we were winning, right? If you were a Marine then.
Mm-hmm. And while you're there, I mean, you said earlier in the podcast, you were in college, you were working on your craft of writing. While you're there, are you doing any writing at all? Are you writing in your head? Or are you thinking about stories that you want to write once you get home? How did this all start happening?
Not really. My Marine, I mean, like, I'm working on writing with my Marines. I wrote like one or two stories, not about the war or anything like that. Just trying to continue to write a little bit
about a bakery in Queens.
Yeah. I didn't, but then I got back. Within a couple of months of getting back, I started writing the first story in Redeployment. So, I wrote the sentence, "We shot dogs," which was the first sentence of the book that I wrote, and remained the first sentence of the book. And sort of went from there.
When you wrote that sentence, did you have some feeling that you were like, something kind of clicked in your head, or was the story already in your mind that you wanted to write?
Yeah, so that I like that sentence and that voice, right? So the opening paragraph of that story felt right. The story changed. It took me a couple of years to finish it, but the overall shape of it remained the same, and the voice remained the same. It was something that story is not set during the time that I was deployed to Iraq. It's set during the second battle of Fallujah, which was in 2004, and the aftermath. And that actually Elliot Ackerman was in that battle. And it was based on a guy that I knew, two folks that I knew who had been in that battle and told me about shooting dogs. But some of the stories specifically were from a guy named Mike Green, who'd been a machine gunner then, who told me about Operation Scooby and had said to me, there's a sentence in that story, "I could spot a dime in the street 20 yards away." That's something he told me, right? He uncovered a torture house where they'd been injecting mercury into a retarded guy's skull for some reason. So some of the images are from, stories that Mike Green told me before I ever deployed, that had just sort of been rattling around in my head. But then when I came back from Iraq, those things, and you also put in other stuff and do more research, but felt like a sort of good way into talking about some of the things that would later concern me throughout that book, which was a lot about sort of homecoming and the experience of coming home and interacting with people after you've been in a war zone, and the sort of what they project on you and what you project on them, and the difficulties of communication.
So before the podcast, we were talking. So you asked me, I am a fan of yours, right? So this is the first edition. The reason I got this book, and well, this is for people who don't know, stories would eventually become this book that Phil wrote. And I got this book because right when I moved to San Francisco, I joined a book club, and this book, I think it was the week it came out. And it was, so that was my introduction to you. One of the stories, and before we did this podcast, I was going back through the book to kind of refresh. I was peeking through the one where the father, the Vietnam vet, tells his son about the horrors and the things like that. And I mean, so you're writing about things that obviously are very, very true. I'm assuming these stories took some time to kind of, they're pretty intense. This isn't something you bang out in a day. And what was the process?
It took 4.5 years to write the book.
Repeat that. How long?
4.5 years to write the book. 4.5 years. Yeah. So that 4.5 for Redeployment, 6 years for Missionaries. Yeah.
Cool. So we'll dive a little bit more into that. But so during those 4.5 years, how were you writing this book? I mean, were you working a full-time job? Were you writing in the morning? Did you have kids? You write when you were doing laundry? I mean, what was your routine like?
Yeah, so no set routine. And, so as I said, I started it while I was still in the Marine Corps, right? And then I got into Hunter's creative writing program.
Okay.
Right? I was actually, Hunter, yeah. I'm just thinking about, like, it was amazing. It was a wonderful place. And I studied with Nathan Englander, Cole McCann, Peter Carey, Claire Massoud, Patrick McGrath.
Nathan's been on the podcast too. He's a character,
incredible
man.
Oh my God,
you said Colin McCann. You have a relationship with Colin, right?
Oh yeah, great guy.
I'm a big fan of his as well, for sure.
Yeah, and I
would love to have him on. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so he called, and I was the officer on duty, and there were these like so this corpsman had gotten very, very drunk and gone home to what he thought was his barracks. This is like 8 p.m. Like, this is not like late enough for anybody to have reasonably been as drunk as this guy was. So all the barracks look the same on a military base, right? So he shows up at what he thinks is his barracks and goes to what he thinks is his room, and is like very upset to see that apparently some Marines have like taken all of his stuff out of his room and put their stuff in and are just sitting in his room, like playing video games or whatever. So he attacks them because they're in his room, in his mind. In reality, it was military police battalions, barracks. So like dealing with drunk corpsmen is something that they have a lot of experience with, right? So it's like perfect. So I show up as the officer on duty because there's this incident, and they've got him in like a sort of like arm bar, and it's one of these things where like if you struggle, it forces your arm into it hurts more. But he's really drunk and belligerent, so he's struggling and then screaming, and they're just going like, and he's like ah, and they're just going like, stop struggling, man. Stop making me hurt you, man. You're doing this to yourself, man. Stop making me hurt you, man.
Make him want to
And that's when Cullum calls, right? So I get the call. I answer it. I'm like, First Lieutenant Klay, 2nd Marine Division, officer on duty. Right? And it's like, this is Colin McCann. In the background, there's just like, stop making me hurt you, man. You're doing this to yourself, man. I'm like, I have a situation to deal with. I will call you back.
Was that your introduction to him, or had you known him before?
Yes, that was my introduction.
Crazy.
So, anyway, yeah. but yeah, so I started when I was still in the Marine Corps.
Yeah.
That's when I wrote, like an early version of the first story in Redeployment was part of my submission package to Hunter. And then I worked on stories, also a novel that I ultimately sort of discarded. There's like a couple chapters in the drawer that I like, but yeah. I had about sort of maybe by the time I graduated Hunter, about maybe 20,000 words worth of stories.
Yeah.
And then that were kind of close to finished. And then I went into a master's in teaching. So I wanted to be a high school English teacher. That's the plan. And so there was a period where I was writing stories. I was in grad school for teaching, and I was student teaching 5th through 8th graders, which was a lot of fun. And they're just like,
I'd imagine that would be a lot of fun
at that age.
Yeah.
It's good.
Yeah.
I did a writing assignment with these kids, and I was trying to get them used to the idea that like a sentence is not just about like the factual information that it conveys, but that there's a lot of like sort of character and emotion and beauty that you can, and humor that you can, in sort of how you write a sentence. I gave them like a list of like, a bunch of first sentences from stories and novels that I like. And they had to pick 3 that they liked, talk about what they liked about them, and then rewrite one of them badly. Right. So they're like kind of deconstructing. And my favorite was the 6th grader rewrote the opening sentence of Moby Dick, "Call me Ishmael," as "Hi, I'm Ishmael," said Ishmael, introducing himself.
It's kind of genius.
It's kind of brilliant. Yeah. So there was a period where I was writing, while doing that. I sold the book while I was at teachers college. So I finished the semester.
Wait. So, all right. So that's the big question, right? So that's what people want to know. You said you sold a book. That's everyone's dream. Who writes?
Right.
So you're writing these stories. At what point are you sharing them with anyone? Or do you have writing friends that you?
Yeah, absolutely. I write obsessively revise, and I was sending stories in stages to multiple people, right? Chris Robinson, Lauren Holmes, Matt Gallagher. For Missionaries, Elliot Ackerman, but everything Lee Carpenter read. My wife reads sort of like, as I get closer to the final version, she reads everything and gives me feedback. I have a buddy, Chris Robinson, who we once calculated that of one of the stories in Redeployment, he read 100,000 words worth of that story, right, in different iterations. And yeah, he's a good friend.
I love word count. I'm obsessed with it.
So I'll say this as far as I like to start out by writing by hand.
Okay.
And when I'm, it's different for a novel. But when I was writing the stories, I'd often sort of have a kind of. Sometimes I'd start with like a voice, right? So for the first story I had a voice, and some of the stories are sort of more written in a straight line, right? So it's like there's a story in the book called Money as a Weapon System, where it's like, all right, like there's like a problem, and then like he's going to try and solve it, and there's a sort of A plot and a B plot, right? Like like there's like a water treatment facility that he's dealing with, and then there's like he has this task to get Iraqi kids to play baseball, right? And they're sort of operating on parallel courses, right? Yeah. And so that is sort of like, cause and effect. One thing follows the other. Some of the stories are written where they're structured, where the sort of the way that the material is organized is along a kind of emotional narrative, right? As the storytelling. So a story like Bodies, that actually the writer Lauren Holmes, who I studied with at Hunter, and wrote a great book of stories called Barbara the Slut and Other People. And you wouldn't, like, from the sort of superficially, you wouldn't think that we're similar, right? Yeah. But in like how we think about fiction actually really jives, and we'd have these discussions, and she helped me figure out, like, okay, like, no, like, like this piece needs to be brought forward, and
were you open
to
that criticism or that feedback?
Yeah.
You were never pushing against it?
Yeah, I mean, like, I think an important part of writing is sort of learning to be more interested in your screw ups than defensive of them, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, I'm obsessive. I mean, like, it's not like you take every piece of advice. Like, an important part of it is being like, oh, that's an interesting point for a story that I'm not trying to write. You know what I mean? Or like, I write that, so I like that, so I'm keeping it. But and sometimes, like, people will tell you, you know, to throw something out that you're like, okay, like, this isn't good, but I wrote it for a reason. So why did I write it? Right.
So, yeah. Well, that's what I was going to get to that. So you said you sold the book. What point?
How'd that happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm assuming once you start getting into that world of submitting it, you're going to start getting that kind of feedback, right? The feedback you were just talking about of, like, you know, this could work. And what was the process like?
No, that was all that stuff was beforehand, right? So,
really?
Like,
okay.
You know, I never focused on.
Were you writing to get it published, or was that even a thought in your mind?
I assumed I would try and publish it at some point, but I was fixated on getting the stuff right. Now, the way that I got to publishing was incredibly lucky, right? Because you can't plan out what people are going to be interested in. Okay. Right now, I don't think people are as interested in war fiction, right? We're still at war, but nobody really cares. So if I had published Redeployment right now, it would have a very different reception. Okay. But when I did publish Redeployment, well, I'll get to that in a second, but basically, John Friedman, they were doing a 10 years after 9/11 issue, right? John knows Nathan Englander, right? Who is my teacher at Hunter.
Oh, I'm sorry. Nathan was teaching you at Hunter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, awesome. Very cool.
Yeah. So now Nathan's agent is married to John Friedman. His partner is John Friedman, is the then editor of Granta. He told Nathan that they were doing this 10 years after 9/11 issue, and Nathan was like, I have a former Marine student. Okay, so that's like, so then he said, okay, have them send me his stuff, and they liked it, and they wanted to publish 2 stories. The first story, Redeployment, and then also on the web they published OIF, which is a short, a very short story written with a lot of acronyms. And so on the basis of that, Scott Moyers at Penguin Press read it, liked it, talked to Andrea Walker, who was there. They wanted to see more stuff. I sent them the 5 stories that I had completed, and then they bought the collection off of that alone, which is kind of crazy, right? And like, I sort of got an agent was there because I'm off at the same time that I got a book deal, pretty much. And that's kind of, that doesn't really happen. But the reason that it happened, especially for a collection of short stories, right? The reason that it happened was in part, I think, because there hadn't been a lot of literary fiction written about the Iraq War that was coming out. I think along the time that this was happening, like,
this is 2011, right?
Yeah, Kevin Powers' like Yellow Birds. I don't think it hadn't been published yet, but it was like on the horizon. So like there had been very little literary fiction written by veterans, right? There'd been memoirs and things, but there was a kind of sense that like people were waiting for it, right? And so the books that came out in that period got a lot of attention, and then there are some like really good war books that came out later that got some attention for sure, but didn't get as much attention some of the earlier books, and it's just just kind of like there's a certain amount of just luck that is a part of this, right? And I got extremely lucky.
But you were also prepared. I mean, you had done the work before. So it wasn't like when this happened all of a sudden, it seemed like it happened fairly quickly. I mean, you had done the work previous. I mean, you were probably confident in your ability to be a writer, I'm assuming. You were probably happy with what you were happy with enough to send it off to try to get it published. I mean, when that first started happening, I mean, what were you thinking just like, holy shit, this is happening? Were you kind of just like, I mean, you're a Marine, so I'm assuming you're pretty level-headed emotionally. You're able to keep your emotions under control. But I mean, inside you were like, holy shit, were you freaking out?
Yeah, I wasn't freaking out, but I was pretty excited.
Yeah.
I was, I knew I had to like work ahead of me because I had only 20,000 words worth written at that point. I had some stories in development, but like as far as stuff that was basically done, I had 5 of the shorter stories from the collection were done. Right.
So when the book came out, what was it like? I mean, we're talking via Zoom because we can't leave our apartments right now. Back then, 2011, when that book came out, I mean, what was it like? Were you going on book tours? I mean, was the reception immediately? We'll get into, obviously, it won the National Book Award, which is a huge thing. What was that process? I mean, what was that time? Do you remember what it was like then? I mean, it must have been
absolutely. It was wild. It was wild.
Yeah.
So it was also extremely stressful.
It's your first book.
Yeah, it's your first book, and it felt like sort of like exposing a raw nerve to the world, right? It's fiction is deeply, deeply personal. It's more personal than nonfiction.
Yeah.
But I was also incredibly lucky, right? I was, the book got very good reviews. The reception was very warm. People really engaged with it. And then, and like veterans liked it too, right? And so
were you speaking with veterans at the time when the book was coming?
Sure.
I mean, you were, yeah.
And also like a lot of people read the book who, maybe weren't necessarily normal readers of like literary fiction, right? But for whom the book spoke to them in some ways. And that was
my
really
father.
Yeah.
So that book comes out now. Obviously, I'm assuming your life changes a little bit. Now you're an author, right? What happens then? I mean, do you immediately start writing that next book? Did you want to do a novel? Did you want to write more short stories? What were you think? I mean, were you like,
I'd already had the idea to work on a Columbia novel. And so I was still in the early stages of research. I do a ton of research, right? I did a ton of research for Redeployment. It's funny because people think like, oh, you're a Marine, so like you're basing this on your experience. It's like, not really.
Yeah. Well, you certainly know your acronyms.
Yeah, yeah, I do. And yeah, so like, I had to like learn enough Spanish to be able to sort of stumble my way through interviews in Colombia when I went down a couple times. And
why Colombia?
A whole variety of reasons. So it's a fascinating conflict, right? Colombia's been the largest recipient of military aid in the Western Hemisphere since the Clinton administration. Actually, you know who helped put that package together? Sort of a militarized drug war? Joe Biden.
Boom.
Playing Colombia. And then it didn't work. Colombia's still producing cocaine. Though the aid was during the Bush years, then shifted to, I'll go into this a little bit in the book, to fighting the FARC directly. And as a military campaign, that was successful, right? So Colombia was sort of discussed as a success case, right? And towards the latter half of the Obama administration, there were a lot of discussions about sort of lessons from Colombia that could be applied to Afghanistan. And also a lot of talk of the use of high value targeting in Colombia as something that could be effective in Afghanistan, which is something I'm extremely skeptical about. So high value targeting, targeted assassinations, right? Us killing people. So in mid 2000s, we started giving the Colombians smart bombs. Now, there's a lot of cross-pollination between conflicts. Every ambassador that we sent to Colombia post 9/11 ended up, you know, in the Middle East wars in some way. Two of our ambassadors to Colombia, their next posting was to be the ambassador to Afghanistan. One of them later said that there was no place that we had more going on than Colombia, including Afghanistan. You had, you know, like 7th Group, Special Forces Group, that was ping-ponging back and forth between Afghanistan and Colombia, Latin America more generally. So there were a lot of reasons. My wife is Colombian American. That's a big one. So it was very easy to go to, you know, Medellin, stay with family.
Helps with the research.
They helped me out a lot and helped me, you know, connect me to everybody from, like, you know, people who grew up in paramilitary towns to the former Minister of the Interior under the Uribe presidency, right, to interview. So that was great. And yeah. Also, like, in terms of, you know, you talk about like targeted assassination, which is a pretty important toolkit in the US's arsenal right now. It's a tool that I have a lot of sort of moral reservations about that are sort of dealt with in the book. You know, the method by which we do that has roots in, like, the hunt for Pablo Escobar, right? And then in Iraq, it kind of gets put on an industrial scale, right? And we go from doing like 12 raids a month by sort of JSOC and in 2004 to 250 a month, right? And that system, right, that we use to kill and capture high value targets, that system gets applied to Colombia and brought to Colombia, where the Colombians are doing the killing, but we're aiding them. And that's something that the novel explores. And so it was a kind of perfect case for what the novel is concerned with, which is not one conflict specifically, but the way that a sort of new way of 21st century warfare has inaugurated, and the way that it sort of exists in all of these different war zones, and sort of things that happen in one place echo in another.
So I want to go back to the beginning of this book. You're coming out of Redeployment. You know, I'm assuming the success of the book wasn't expected. I mean, I'm assuming, yeah. So
you don't put out a short story collection and expect,
of course not.
Anything.
So
I mean, like, it's crazy, right? It was utterly insane.
Yeah. So you're coming out of that, right? As you can see, there's a guitar behind me. I've spent most of my life touring in bands. The big thing in the music world is the sophomore slump, right? It's, you know, you have this band that, you know, writes this record, takes them 20 years to write the first record, and then they have 1 year to write the second record. Coming out of that first book with the success, a couple of questions, you know, was it not necessarily a question of doubt, but were you thinking to yourself, was there a bar that you felt you had to live up to now? And if so, you know, were you really concerned about it? If not, were you really even thinking about redeployment when starting this project?
The bar is set by the material, right? By what you're trying to communicate. So it's not like people have this is the thing. Like, I knew, like, you know, because of Redeployment, there's some people who are going to go in and read Missionaries, and they would read it sympathetically, right? And then there were some people who could go in and read Missionaries unsympathetically because of Redeployment, right? And you just know that starting off the bat.
But the reading,
you also,
all that matters.
You also sort of, like, there's a way in which, like, one thing that's kind of funny is, at this point, I've written 2 books with a lot of different sort of voices and characters and perspectives, right? And one thing that's kind of funny is, like, so for Redeployment, there would be reviews that were like, I like this book, but these 2 stories are bad, right? And then there'd be like another, you know, but this story is great. And then there'd be another review that'd be like, no, that story is terrible, but these 2 stories are great, and be the same stories, but just with the polarities switched, right? And you get the same thing for Missionaries. Like, some people are like, you know, like, Abel and Juan Pablo are awesome, and some people are like, no, like, these characters are bad, but these characters are good. And at this point, I think I've had different reviewers say their 4 main voices, like, each one has been either the good one or the bad one, according to some reviewer, which I actually kind of take as like a compliment, right? That I'm sort of approaching the things from a different enough angle that, like, some people are going to find something to like in each thing. You can't worry about, like, some abstract sense of what, like, a critic is going to be drawn to. you have to be true to the material, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being true to the material in some cases is going to mean writing something that some critic is going to dislike because you did it right? Because they don't like that thing, right? So the form of the book and the shape of it and the way that you're trying to go about it has to be determined by the nature of the book that you're trying to write, right? Rather than some sort of sense of what the public's going to want, which is like shifting anyway, like, as I said, like Redeployment was successful in large part because the timing was right. And I got really lucky, I mean, the head judge of the National Book Award, when I won, had been a correspondent in the Middle East as part of her career, right?
That's what it is.
She's an amazing writer. I have unbelievable gratitude, right, for her. But it also meant that there was somebody on the panel who like knew that world like really well, right, and was probably invested in it, like that's always going to factor in. So all you can do is be as true as possible, and that means that like in a day of writing is a day of writing. You don't think about that sort of reception notion as you're writing it, because you're it also doesn't matter. Like a day of writing, like there are plenty of days of writing stock, like, and the beauty of writing is like it doesn't matter. Crappy writing this day, go back tomorrow, and like you just throw it out, like throw out the stuff that was bad, and you don't even have to figure it out yourself. You'd be like, all right, I wonder what Matt Gallagher thinks of this, and he'll have some ideas maybe that'll help me fix this problem. What does Chris Robinson think? What does Elliot think? What does Lauren think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at the back end of finishing my first novel. I published.
Congrats.
Thanks. Yeah, I published a novella 3 weeks before the world shut down. Then I started this podcast more as self-therapy to finish this novel. Now that I'm at the back end of it, it's interesting. If I hadn't put out that first book, I would not have been able to accomplish what I have accomplished with this novel. So you're sitting here, you're talking about, reviewers and critics with your legs crossed and a smile. Now that you're on your second book, do you even, what is that even a part of your world anymore? I mean, or like you said, you're writing for the material to be true to yourself. At the first time when you were getting praise, I mean, how were you taking the criticism on the first book? Was there any criticism at all?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, there were always things that people didn't like, right? So, but the thing about it was like, the first book was what I wanted to say at the time, right? So, I sort of think of putting out a book as like a extremely rigorous and time-consuming way of sort of offering up something as part of an ongoing conversation, right? And I feel like that is what I wanted to say at that time. So it's not like I would go back and write the book differently according to some criticism, right? Like once in a while, like there's a sentence or here or there where I'm like, well, I would change that, right? There's one sentence in one story. And it's one of the first stories. So I often read at readings. I'll read. So like for what works at a reading tends to be the stories that are written more like you tell something to somebody in a bar, right? And some of the stories are kind of more like, like people like the story from the perspective of the chaplain, but it doesn't read as well.
And you had to learn that, right? You had to learn that.
Yeah. I was part of a vets writing group through NYU, and we had done, readings at KGB bar for like a while before we were published, and that was a great experience. And those guys are really important to me still, and I'm still good friends with them, and they were early readers for the book as well. But so with 10 Clicks South, there's like one sentence that I always omit, and every time I get to it, I'm just like, oh, how did that get in the book? It's like not a good sentence, but like I like the story and I'm proud of the story. So like I would change that sentence, but like whatever. The book is what I wanted to say at the time, and like people picked it up and like engaged with it, and that's deeply, deeply gratifying.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, like I think I'm more shaped, like, you know, like every once in a while there'll be a critic who says that they disliked it, right? And but it tends to be more interesting to engage with people who read the book and then have something that they want to say in response to it, rather than like somebody being like, this didn't please me. You know, it's like, all right, well,
yeah,
good for you.
Tough
right?
Shit.
Like, okay. But like, if you have something substantive to say, right? If you have like a sort of intellectual argument that you want to make with the book, that might be interesting, right?
Yeah.
That might be something that'll shape the way that I think. I mean,
and
I think
worth your time.
Right. You know, so, you know, I think like, if you think of somebody like Viet Thanh Nguyen, right? He's a book that he wrote, nonfiction. You know, obviously, you know, people know him as The Sympathizers and The Refugees is his fiction, but he's a nonfiction book called Nothing Ever Dies, which is about the literature around the Vietnam War, right? And he has a lot of very thoughtful things to say about war narrative and the ways that war narratives are constructed. That was certainly something that I was thinking about when I was writing Missionaries, right? So that and you know, that kind of thing can be extremely useful, but it has to be criticism that's where there's an argument behind it, not you know, there's a lot of fairly shallow criticism out there. And there are few critics who are very, very thoughtful, right? The kind of critic that I hate is where they seem to be taking a certain pleasure in trying to take a reader down and are more interested in the quips than in making an argument that I can actually sort of sink my teeth into.
It's about themselves, right? Almost,
yeah. And the reasons that I dislike that are twofold. One, you know, if somebody, like if a writer spends several years working on a novel, like if you take pleasure in trying to take them down a peg because, you know, it didn't please you, you're an asshole. But two, and this is not to say like I've written negative book reviews, you know, like, you know, when I felt that the work deserved it. But two, if it's just that, then you're not actually saying anything, right? Other than expressing, it can be interesting the way that a book fails, right? If you approach a bad book with rigor, then a negative book review can actually be interesting and useful. And that kind of reviewer is not actually engaging with the work in a serious way that's sort of worthy of respect. So, you know.
So all that said, was there any
so if somebody's making a negative argument of that kind, right, then that's the kind of feedback that I'd be interested in.
Yeah.
Right.
It's what's constructive. You know. That said, though, was there any change in the routine of your writing from the first book to the second book?
Yeah, but like as I said, like my writing is I was writing this book at different places. You know, like when I was in teachers college, right? Like I was like writing on the train. I was you know, taking the train in and writing, and then writing like on the subway after, you know, teaching middle schoolers up to teachers college, and you know, so writing on the subway, and then like, yeah, I'm not like,
you don't lock yourself in a room and,
you know, be in a castle with an ostrich quill dipped in the blood of my enemies.
Yeah.
I have, you know, an ostrich quill dipped in the blood of my enemies. I just, you know, I use it for henna tattoos. Yeah, I usually start out writing by hand. I usually did a ton of research beforehand. It's you know, when I was writing a story, I would have these sort of ideas or images or scenes that I would kind of circle around. I sort of thought of these little jewels that I was going to construct, right? So there would be things that to me felt like they resonated against each other, even if it didn't necessarily make sense, right? So it was like, give you an example. So there's a story in the book called Psychological Operations, and this like watching somebody die through a thermal scope, right, was one image that sort of stayed in my mind. And then another thing that stayed in my mind was the idea of this type of psychological warfare they'd done in Fallujah, where they had actually literally like called out Arabic insults to taunt people and to like pissing them off. And that stayed in my mind. And then like I had this idea of pairing that with like a veteran on a college campus. And somehow like I knew that I was going to go through those three things. I didn't know how. For writing Missionaries, there's a story about clowns. We'll put it that way. And as soon as it's a true story. As soon as I read it in a fantastic book by Juanita Leon, this journalist, Colombian journalist, Redeployment was the book. I knew I was going to use it in my novel. I didn't know how, right? And then, you know, maybe like a year later, after I'd been like reading other stuff and sort of thinking about it, it ended up fitting into this one section of one of Juan Pablo's chapters. So I'll sort of let these ideas sort of sit and accumulate meaning. I'll do research of sort of various levels. I'll interview people. I'll read nonfiction books. I'll read fictional books. It's like I'll read kind of like philosophical stuff that feels like people are working in line with the kind of ideas that I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. All trying to get like a sort of very rich sense of, you know, a particular place, what it looks like, what the culture is, what the what type of weapons and technology people are using, what types of experiences people might have had, and what kinds of ideas they might have had about what they're going through, and then sort of slowly kind of create characters around that, or sort of put the characters into those scenes, and then things, you know, radically evolve from there.
So the brand new book is out. Let everyone know what it's called.
Missionaries, yeah.
And now, are you the kind of guy you already working on the next thing? I mean, what's your plan now? How do you go about living your life?
Starting the research for the next thing, which involves like reading a bunch of like Czech dissident authors.
Was the idea in your head a while ago, or is this kind of a new idea?
It's been in my head for a while. The second novel, so very different. What I'm going to be working on.
Okay.
My maternal grandfather was a career diplomat, was ambassador to Czechoslovakia in the 1970s, and so it was sort of interesting time. You know, spies all around. Obviously, my aunts have some great stories from that time, and and they're both committed Catholics, and my grandmother, and at the time, women were not taken particularly seriously. It would, you know, my grandmother would end up doing a lot of work, very relevant for the mission, but you know, like it always pissed her off that at dinners, you know, her name would just be wife of, right? But for certain types of work, not being taken seriously was a benefit. And when the Italian ambassador was heading home, the Italian ambassador's wife came to my grandma and basically explained that she had been, during her time there, a liaison for Vatican City with the Czech Catholic resistance to the communists, and she wanted my grandmother to take up that role. Now, my grandmother wanted to do it, but ultimately they decided, like, as the wife of the American ambassador, is just too high profile, right? But I figured, why not write a spy novel imagining if my grandmother had said yes.
All right. So Phil, that's a blast. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. At the end of the podcast, I always ask a couple of questions. First and foremost, where are people buying your books from? What's your favorite bookstore? I know you're a New York guy, but can you give some shout outs?
Yeah, so Q and Willow is my local bookstore in Kew Gardens.
Any favorite stores around the country? You can think any place you've done some cool readings at, things like that?
Oh yeah, man.
I think of bookstores as rock clubs.
So
you know, when you're on book
like
tour,
Greenlight in Brooklyn, Books are Magic in Brooklyn. Yeah. I love like Powell's has been amazing.
Have you ever read in San Francisco?
I have never read in San Francisco proper. Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever been to SF?
But I did I have. I did for the San Francisco Liquid Book Festival.
Oh, most definitely.
Via Zoom. So I probably would have had the opportunity had it not been for the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I think we're on the other side of it, and I'm hoping, you know, life gets kind of back to normal. But Phil, this has been an absolute pleasure.
This has been wonderful. Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. Oh, and also, are you Instagrams, Twitter? What's your handle?
Phil Klay is my Twitter.
Cool. Yeah. Great. Phil, enjoy the rest of the day, man.
You too.
Take care. Bye-bye.